you everybody for joining us for this edition of African Liberty webinar. My name is Ibrahim Babatunde Anoba. As usual, we have these conversations once every month, and this month's edition we are going to be looking at an economic angle to Africa's current state, and this will be in relation to the role of China and the United States as trade partners on the continent. And as you are aware, there has been of recent higher involvement of the Chinese Communist Party in many African countries' economic affairs, even up to the African Union. And we've also seen recently America's so-called comeback into the continent, first with the Africa strategy unveiled by President Trump, and recently followed by President Biden. And of course, as many of you are aware, particularly for our friends in Ghana, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, I think still is in Ghana right now. So this shows or demonstrates that both the US and China have priorities, economic priorities, frankly, in Africa, in addition to security and other diplomatic priorities. So for this reason, we find it really pertinent to have our audience engage this topic, and which is the reason why we employ the volunteer services of Tam Alex, Folarin Opeyemi, who should be joining us, hopefully, and Dr. Felix Kuma. Dr. Felix Kuma is currently among us, but we're trying to get his audio set up. So Tam Alex is a political economist and electricity entrepreneur. He publishes Nigeopolis, a magazine dedicated to advocating for the absolute rights of Nigerians to life, liberty, and prosperity. He's also the co-founder of the Nigeria Libertarian Project, executive producer of the Despite the Government podcast, and a senior fellow here at African Liberty. Tam also develops and operates electricity systems in underserved and communities in Nigeria. So welcome, Tam.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
Thank you. And sure, it's nice to have you. Dr. Felix Kuma Abiwu is the founding director of the Center for African Studies and associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Kent State University. He received his PhD in political science from West Virginia University. He also studied at Ohio University and the Legon Center for International Affairs and Diplomacy at the University of Ghana. Dr. Kuma Abiwu's research focuses on the politics of development, African security issues, democratization in Africa, and foreign policy analysis. And yeah, it's a pleasure to have you, Dr. Felix Kuma.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Awesome.
Oh, excellent.
Great. That's great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and lastly, Folarin Opeyemi is a policy engagement analyst, politician, entrepreneur, and social commentator. He holds a BSc in computer science and economics from Leeds City University, Ibadan. He was the House of Representative candidate in the last general election in the 2019 and 2023 elections, where he ran for a seat in the National Assembly in Nigeria to represent Mushin Federal Constituency in Lagos. Folarin has over 6 years of experience in entrepreneurship, governance, and public policy advocacy. He has been featured in magazine, radio, and TV stations, including Sahara TV, Radio, and Daybreak Africa. Hopefully, Folarin Opeyemi will join us. But it is an immense pleasure to have you, Tam and Dr. Kuma. Just to start off, as I illustrated at the beginning of the conversation, maybe we should start with you, Dr. Kuma. Both the US and China have made their intents and interest, in fact, very clear on the continent. But as we've seen, it seems as though it's business as usual for most of Africa. In other words, we are getting the aid, but it's not efficiently transitioning into immediate economic dividend for the people. Why do we need to continue our economic engagement with both China and the US, Doctor?
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the panel today. And sorry for the technical hitch. I'm glad I'm finally here. My full name is Felix Kuma Abio. I think the Abio is missing somewhere, but that's okay. First of all, I just want to thank you for the leadership of African Liberty. I think when I was reading your mission, I must commend you for the important work you are doing. Peter got in touch with me. I don't know how he got my information, but I'm sure, of course, my information is online. I just want to commend all of you for the work you are doing, engaging in these critical discussions and dialogue about the continent. I care about the continent. I live in the United States, but as you said, my research focus and my work is mainly on the continent of Africa. And I also want to thank my fellow panelists. It's an honor to share this platform with you today. Yeah, you're right. You know, I remember almost 30 years ago, I'm not too old, but China is a big economy. At the time, wasn't a big economy. China wasn't of course, when it comes to population-wise, China, you know, we know it's a big country, but when it comes to geopolitics of the global environment, China could not be considered from a political science point of view as a great power. But within the last 30 years, we're going to find a way, explanations of how China has become a great power, you know, whether we like it or not, to the United States. China is now the major competitor to the United States. And you could see within the last couple of years, and even last week, the United States Congress has passed, trying to pass a resolution on a bill to strike China of being a developing country, because that security competition is raising a lot of questions, many scholars are thinking. So when it comes to China and the United States, as we know, during the Cold War era, Africa has always been considered as a battleground for major powers. Africa's role in international affairs has always been considered in the periphery, but there's no question that Africa is a major player in the international system. Why is that the case, that Africa has always been a key attraction to the so-called global major powers? We have the resources. Africa is the only continent, you know, that has so much resources that has fueled the industrialization of Europe. You know, think about way back to the slave trade and how Africa, you know, the resources, the human resources of Africa has been used to develop the United States, to develop Europe, and underdevelop Africa, and during colonialism. So Africa has been, you know, a kind of focus point for these great powers for a very long period of time. And as we know, I would describe it as China has been making this inroad on the continent of Africa within the last 30 years, but the US seems to be, in quote, sleeping. And now they realize that, wow, there's something going on the continent where Africa is systematically engaging. And we're going to talk more about this in many sectors and governments, and then they have their own worldview of the world. So you could see the competitiveness as we speak now. The vice president is on the continent. For the past few weeks, we have other high-profile US, officials who are on the continent. So broadly, Africa has the resources. Africa is the future, the rising middle class, the market base. So these two major powers, their eyes are on Africa. So we're going to see whether this engagement from the US and China, how is that going to benefit the continent? So those are the kind of things. So I'm going to introduce it here, you know, for now, but just from a historical perspective, we have the resources they need. We have the human power. We have the market, over 1 billion people. So that has been the key attraction for these major powers.
Thank you, Prof, for that historical background. So you made the case for why this history really matters for us to get a proper context of what is actually going on. So Tam, I haven't already said this historical background. as someone who is purely interested in economics, why do you think this is actually a good thing for Africa, for us to have both China and the US, two of the superior economics in the world, fighting over opportunities on the continent? Why is this a good thing for Africa, or otherwise, why do you think it's a bad thing?
It's a good thing. I'll answer this question from two perspectives. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry for interjecting. Maybe the next person, and then I'll come. Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Thank you for the question, Ibrahim. It's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity. Just going off what Dr. Kuma has talked about, I think that it's beneficial actually for two world powers to overall try to engage with Africa with respect to trade, because we understand why trade wants to happen. Somebody has something you want and you have something they want. You can exchange that. The United States specifically and China want resources. They have large economies. The US wants a lot of coltan to build high technology. China needs a lot of energy resources because they don't have a lot, especially oil and gas. And we want infrastructure at Africa. We want some type of economic development. So that gives an opportunity for us to exchange. But I think the important part is trying to balance that relationship with both powers and looking at the terms of which we sign, with respect to when you want to borrow money and what money is exactly being borrowed for. So far, so good. We've seen that in general, when African countries want to borrow from China, they usually borrow for infrastructure or development. But it's important to look at the terms of those agreements. So what happens when you can't pay? What happens in terms of defaults? Are you going to have to give up an asset you have? We heard of the reports in Uganda where, because they borrowed, I think about $207 million and couldn't pay, they were in risk of defaulting. There was a potential of taking over the Entebbe airport, which is the only airport in Uganda. This already happened in Sri Lanka in the I think it's a Hambantota port, where Sri Lanka couldn't pay and China took over the port for a 99-year lease, which is an important strategic location, I believe, on the Indian Ocean. So these are important issues that we need to look at, even though in general, the United States approach to Africa is fairly different than China, because the United States is more interested in giving resources for support good governance, to support institutions, and also with respect to rule of law. There are a lot of strings attached sometimes, as they call it, but China doesn't have strings attached. But I think it's important to look at the terms of the agreement and also increase transparency. It was an issue that in many of those agreements that China signs with African countries, they have what you call a confidentiality clause. That means you should not talk about the terms of the agreement, or it should not be made public. More recently, that has changed. I think starting with the Mombasa-Nairobi railway that was built, where the parliament in Kenya had issues with that, to talk about why. We have to talk about the terms of these agreements, and I think the transparency part of it that worries a lot of people. There is not a lot of transparency, but if we can encourage transparency, we can get the resources we need to build the infrastructure we need to build the roads we need. So, somebody can get in a car from, I don't know, Algiers in Algeria and drive all the way down to Lagos and be safe, and, something like that. It would be very important if we can connect East and West Africa, because right now there is no road that actually you can drive from East to West Africa directly. There's no road that leads directly to that. We should be able to have that, and that could encourage much more intra-African trade. And if we can get the resources from the United States or China to build those roads and the necessary infrastructure, I think that'll be important. But we do need more oversight over these transactions, even if they take time to close a deal. I think because transactions are 20, 30-year long, I think it's worth it for at least a generation of Africans that will come after us. So we don't mortgage their future to pay for today.
I like the fact that you mentioned the intra-Africa trade component of it, because indeed we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which you and Professor Kumabi would knows very well. And staying on the angle of economics, Professor Bill, we clearly, of course, there is the fact that America's economy is one of the most powerful, right? But it's also one of the most indebted countries. That's an enormous debt. So it's not really a problem for countries to have debt. So that's on the one side. On the other side is that, as Tam mentioned, we do have this Continental Free Trade Agreement that we want to promote, right? And we do know that a huge component of that agreement giving us progressive dividends or economic dividends on the long run is contingent upon our ability to have infrastructure, road networks, airports, seaports, and whatnot. So if China is giving us those help by building us these airports and seaport, Professor Kumabi, why is that a problem? Or why is that a problem? I just want us to actually treat that one problem, the infrastructure problem, head on before we move on.
Thank you very much. First of all, that's not a problem. We need that. One of the major challenges that we have on a continent is infrastructure. I don't want to, praise the colonial authorities per se, but during the colonial project, we know that they were able to build, selected infrastructure, and many of those, of course, I'm from Ghana, many of those infrastructure very well, and all that leads to the resource areas where they're going to get the resources. Now we know the challenges that many part of Africa, we had in the post-colonial era, in the immediate years of post-colonial era. Our first president, Nkrumah, was able to do a lot for the country, but the interventions, military and all that has really slowed down the infrastructure development of many part of Africa. So as I'm speaking now, as you said earlier on, we don't even have railway to connect, very efficient one, Ghana, Nigeria, or West Africa, or any other part of it. So that's one of the attractions of many governments on the continent of Africa to China, because China is asserting just after the end of the Cold War, as you suggested, the West gave us, support to build our democratic institutions. And many of these really help. Many countries build their democratic institutions and all that, but not many has been done in the infrastructure area. Even those that has been done, through IMF and all that, still the debt on us. So we are in an era now in many parts of Africa where we lack that basic infrastructure. When in terms about even the road, the railways, the power issues, talking about power, we know Nigeria faces that challenge. Ghana faces that challenge. I was just back from South Africa by a month ago. I'm going to be taking students to South Africa in May for study abroad, and the load shedding is a challenge. South Africa is a well-developed economy, but those are the challenges. So when our policymakers, political elite, realize that the next phase for Africa's development, we need that infrastructure. We need the roads, the bridges, the railways. We need digital infrastructure and all that. And here is the case where China has grown so much in terms of their economic power, and China is willing to do that. So many countries in Africa, without the conditionality, as we established earlier on. So many countries in Africa, without having the critical thinking about, okay, we have this access to loans, banks, loans, and all that with government support from China. We can go in for this huge loan, for this huge infrastructure development, which is okay. But the transparency aspect, if I could just add up to what my colleague said, is a question, because some of these ones, not only the loan, but our various countries are sitting away our resources as part of the bargain. So how is the future going to look like? So in one sense, as a realist, I understand where many of our leaders are coming from. They need the infrastructure now. But the question, or the critical question, which I'm happy we are engaging here, is that what are the key elements of those agreements? Some of them are not very well discussed. Then in many legislatures, they just rubber stamp. So that's the area where many are concerned about, because those infrastructure development is going to be in the long term. Where is that going to be for the continent? So I don't have a problem for our government, for our policy makers, having this access to this huge capital to develop the infrastructure of the continent, which we need. But at the same time, the key aspect, which scholars like us, policy analysts, that this needs to be transparent, this needs to be debated. So we know how the future, what is the interest rate? Do you have some other areas that, has been given up, mineral resources, and what is the term of the loan? And some are transparent, others are not. So that's the challenge. So yeah, to some extent, we need this for the continent. But at the same time, okay, what do we do as Africans, as active citizens, participants, to hold our leaders accountable that, yeah, we need this element of development, but at the same time, we don't want to sell the future away, from our citizens. So it's a debate, which, is always important to have this the debates on these critical issues.
Well taken, Prof. I still want us to treat that transparency component to these agreements. Because as we have seen, or as we all know, not all diplomatic, military, even trade agreements are made public in the US or in the UK. I mean, certainly some. If, for example, in the US, if the president wants to strike any arms deal or arms agreement, of course, the Arms Committee in Congress have to know, and that's pretty much it in many cases. So a lot of African leaders have said, well, why do you need to know? All you need to know is to see the roads being built, the train station being built. And Tam, I want to come to you. In many of these cases, we've actually seen those roads being built, those airports being built in Zambia, the train station in Nairobi, is it to Mombasa to where was that, being built. So there is this pushback by the government agents that why do you need to know the components of these agreements when in fact the person that want to give us the money, China, is saying they are much more comfortable if they're not made public. So why can't we push our leaders to engage in sensible agreements, not to sell us off, instead of pushing for the openness of this trade agreement? Do you agree with that argument, Tam?
I mean, it depends. So I'm not against getting the best people to negotiate those agreements. I think that's important. And I believe that if you're going to spend other people's monies and mortgage future of your generation, I think it's incumbent on you to let the people know. And those who are interested can get involved. I'm okay with making the agreements public. At the same time, it's not the case that everybody's voice, it's a democracy. If you vote for your leaders, most African countries are not. Some African countries are democracies, loosely used. If you vote for your leaders, you should expect them to do the best. But it's important to also make those agreements public, especially if you're using national debt. I think while it's easy for a lot of experts or scholars, and I'm by no means an expert in African China trade agreements here, so I need to put that caveat out there. Why it's easy to criticize, how China engages with different African countries, I think it's important that we see that they are willing to borrow countries that are not investment grade. That is whose credit worthiness are not, or credit rating is not investment grade, and they're willing to borrow money for long periods of times. And what do you do? I mean, we've been in this conversation before. We talk about Nigeria. What do you do when you go to the bank to borrow money when you never had a credit history? they ask you to bring your house as a collateral. That is a shrewd negotiating tactic. China is not giving you money for free. It's important to remember that. And I think we like to forget that in many cases, what is the alternative? Don't you want a railway to be built between Mombasa and Nairobi, two of the most important cities in Kenya? Why are they not connected? I don't think Kenya's credit worthiness is investment grade. That is a serious problem. But if I'm willing to borrow you that money, I think it's important that, you know, I secure something in return. And if you look at some of the studies, it's not that the lending processes are predatory. Actually, it's that China is sort of kind of mitigated its risk. But to your question, should we make that public? I think it's important to make that public too, because you're telling the entire, if you're building infrastructure, assumably for the entire country, and you're borrowing and using money from the country over 30 years, I think it's important that you make it public. I'm not making this secret. I don't think that's I don't think that speaks to the point of having a democracy. And I think there are issues with that with respect to public finance and the management of public funds. And I think if people know we can hold, because we can't hold China responsible, we can hold our leaders responsible, who can hold China responsible? And I think that chain should not be broken. Two things can be right at the same time. It's okay to make it public, but it's okay to see that we need infrastructure. And it's okay to see that if China is willing to borrow us the money, which a lot of it usually comes from the Chinese government directly. Some of it comes from, you know, private institutions in China, but a lot of it comes from the Chinese government through its different state-owned companies. I think it's important that you make that public. So if something goes wrong, we can point out what went wrong along the line, and we can hold people responsible, especially for those transactions. And that can give a lot more people to comment, a lot more skilled technocratic people to be involved in that process. I'm not saying open it up to everybody, but I'm saying that at least because you're taking huge debt that is going to fall back on the country. I mean, you can see the issue in the last year or so, many African countries are in debt distress again. You know, I think Ghana had to default on debt servicing last year or something. So this is, you know, to avoid that, we need to see, I think, if we're going to do that, I think it's important that you make it public. But at the same time, I think it's important that if you can get somebody to borrow you money, even with the fact that your credit rating is poor, I think you should allow them to actually want to mitigate their risk, because that's the only way they can borrow you that money. So yes, I think two things can be true at the same time.
Well said, Tad. So I want us to dive to the political aspect now, to just segue from the economic side. But before we proceed, I'll recognize Folarin is here with us. Folarin, thanks for joining us. We'll give you like a couple of minutes to just settle down, then we come to you. But my next question will be to Professor Kumar Biwu. But before I ask you the question, I just want to say for the audience, instead of raising hands, please drop your questions in the Q&A box. We do have one question which we're going to come to later, but please drop your question in the Q&A box. I'll be sure to ask them. So, about political ramification or geopolitical ramification of these trade deals, many analysts have made the point that having China as an option is actually good for Africa, because then we can, play more power politics in the international system. We can have an ally to, for example, push for permanent seat in the UN. We can depend or expand our options in terms of alliance, not just only fixated into with the America, UK, France bloc. And as you know very much, Prof, that during the Cold War era, this was actually one of the good things for Africa. People like Nkrumah here, they had the options of dealing with Mao, with the presence in the UK, which in the US and UK Prime Minister. So we had all these options, from the red to from the red of the Soviet Union to the US and elsewhere. So it seems like this is another, or potentially another, multiplicity of options for African leaders in terms of geopolitical power. So do you think that is an actual valid idea to float, or is this something sinister, you think?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good question, and a very important one that many experts are battling with. Before I address your question again, in terms of whether Africa is now caught in the middle between the great power rivalry between the United States, now is seeming just going that road between the United States and China. As you know, yes, to some extent, during the Cold War, the East and the West, Africa has, I wouldn't say benefited a lot, but, for instance, you mentioned Nkrumah. Nkrumah was able to navigate the East and the West. He was towing towards the East, but at the same time, was able to get a major loan from the West to build Al Kosombo Dam. So he knew, he was a savvy political figure. He knew how to balance. But largely, the geopolitics of the Cold War really created many, many challenges for the continent of Africa, whether the wars, the proxy wars that were fought and others. So it did not put Africa in a very, I will argue, in a very better perspective, because again, it reduced our role, a major role in the international system. Africa is always considered as, just like the periphery, and two powers are taking advantage of us. So it's the same thing which is going now, which is like, emerging. Now we know, now make this argument. Just after the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama, who wrote the book, The End of History. Yes, his idea was that, okay, we now live in a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy ethos and values are going to permeate, and that was the beginning point. His philosophical thoughts, to a great extent, shaped U.S. engagement with China, because, there's no controversy to say that U.S. has been instrumental in the West in the rise of China economically. So the argument that, okay, we can engage with China, and then the floodgates open, China entered the WTO, and then you have American companies moving to China, technology transfer. Now, at the same time, you have Professor Meshama, from the University of Chicago, who wrote this book, The Tragedy of Great, Power and Great Power Politics. I remember I read that book when I was in grad school. He was warning that, wait a minute, now, if you open up too much to China, what is going to happen is that China is going to grow economically, and by the logic of balance of power and then the realist theoretical perspective of understanding the world, when China grows economically, what is going to happen is going to translate into military power, and that's going to be a huge competitor to the United States. Now, Meshama's arguments was ignored, but we could see that element today, which is, gradually emerging. So China grew within the last 3 decades, economically powerful. So what happened? They translating that big economic progress and the advancement into military capabilities. And the idea is that, of course, that's how nations behave in the international system, which is anarchical, they want to build to protect themselves and to dominate. So now China is trying to craft a world vision for themselves, not only dominate, Asia, but globally. So Africa has come into this picture. So my worry, and the worry of many experts, is that nobody wants global war. Nobody wants, world war anymore. But the way China is growing, and then the Taiwan issue is putting the United States at a very, very, key observing, their movements and all that. So now China is translating that, of course, to the continent of Africa. You mentioned the key point. Africa, at the UN, we have a voting bloc. Of course, I just wrote a piece on that. Africa, we need a permanent, seat at the Security Council. yeah, China could be that support, but the point is that what next? Now, China, we know, has a military base now in East Africa. So my worry as an observer of the continent and the one who studied the continent is that I wouldn't like coming back to a kind of a bipolar system, you know, of the global system during the Cold War. After the Cold War, we, of course, the US emerged as a unipolar, and then you have multiple powers, you know, kind of multipolar world. I would prefer a kind of multipolar world, you know, where you can have that regional balance, the balance of power, you know, creating that stability for the world. But at the same time, what is going on now is that with the rise of China, with the rapid rise of China and the military buildup and all that, it looks like we are emerging into a bipolar world. And once we emerge into a bipolar world, that is not going to be very helpful for the continent of Africa, because the contradiction here is that we have embraced democratic reforms, okay, for some time now. The point is that what is China's vision for the world? Is it authoritarian system? Is that a kind of political system we're going to embrace? So that's the question is, does China present a very viable alternative when it comes to liberal ideas? We can debate this, liberal ideas of democracy. It is difficult to pinpoint. So one way we are embracing the economic benefits from China, but what about the political aspect? So these are questions that our leaders, policy makers will have to think critically about, which is the best option for us, for the continent.
Right. Well said, Prof. Just to clarify on bipolar, unipolar, it's not the disorder. It's segmenting of global power into two arms, bipolar or multiple power players. So that's what the Prof means for many.
Yeah. Sorry for good. I'm assuming everyone knows it. That's okay. But thanks for the.
Right. Okay, but more so on your point about this multipolar world, having more options just beyond the capitalist American communist China. I want to come to you, Folarin, on that point. Also because one of our audience, Aruna Rashid Mohammed, asked the question, aren't there options out there other than US-led West and China? Folarin, I don't know if you're there, but if you're there, can you help us try to think about other options available for African leaders to get infrastructure fixed, to get loans for many of our development projects, or to even get partners for our political agenda and international system? Are there options out there beyond China and the US? Your microphone is muted, Folarin. Your microphone, okay, good now.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, idea options. At the moment, I think we have limited options. So we are the two leading power brokers. Referring to the US and China. Yeah, they are making efforts, trying to position themselves as the only viable options, because they are looking at the post-COVID era, how the two economies was able to recover fully from the epidemic. It tells you about the resilience of the two countries. In respect to US and China, yes, and over the years, US haven't provided much to Africa. More like trying to impose their will, their worldview to us. Yeah, and some of these African countries haven't been receptive of their policies, haven't been receptive to their views on policies in terms of most especially adopting their democracy. And we've seen how democracy have failed in some part of the countries, name it in Niger, where the military has toppled government. And so it tells you something that fundamentally, US need to do more by engaging African countries individually in ensuring that they address each African countries according to their needs. I think that's very, very important. Not just formulating a policy and compelling other African countries to align with it. I think it shouldn't be, and that is the slight edge China has above US, because China tried to get feedback from the countries. Okay, how do you see some of our policy? How do you see how our trade policy will even address specific needs in your country? I think that's very, very important. I think what needs to be done going forward now is that we need to develop ourselves. There's need for African countries, especially the political leadership, also to pay more attention to productivity. And how do you go about that? Is about improving your education system, because getting the right skill sets to develop yourself, to ensure that you can export technologies right from Africa, from the continent outside there. So we can't keep relying on these foreign people. Yes, we need them for the short time, maybe to address our immediate needs, which is very, very good. I think going forward now, we need to carry out an in-house re-engineering, and also the responsibility of the political leadership. They owe more to the country, because it's all about our future. It's all about the future of the coming generation. They need to invest massively to our healthcare system, our education system, and then they need to demonstrate more transparency, because without transparency, you can't attract foreign investment. Of course, no investment will want to invest his or her money in a certain political environment. If policy, somersault. I talk of lack of infrastructure, and also investment-friendly policy that will attract investors to your country, that will ensure that your productivity level is stimulated to a certain extent. I think that is very, very important also. So first thing first, we need these two leading economic giants, and also we need to rebuild ourselves. We need to educate ourselves more. We need to do much more, because they can't give us everything we want, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Folarin. I love that point. We actually need to challenge our politicians as strongly as we are trying to challenge China publicly. But we wish you had gotten into the National Assembly so you can, push for all these challenges yourself. But good point. For one of our attendees requesting French translation, unfortunately, we cannot translate to French at this point. But I don't know. We're gonna have the uploaded video on YouTube. Maybe Google Translate could work with YouTube. I don't know how that works, but unfortunately, we only have capacity for English at this point. I want to come to you, Tam, and we have this elaborate comment directed to you from David in Lovell, and I would like for you to respond to that comment. So David says, Tam referred to the Ambantoda port in Sri Lanka and the Entebbe port in Uganda as evidence of Chinese lending practices of attaching physical infrastructure in case of debt default, or attacking physical infrastructure. These two projects have been in the media, but have also been debunked as myths. The idea of Chinese debt trap has been largely dispelled. In fact, China's lending towards Africa has fallen off a cliff as African countries have experienced debt distress. This inaccuracy harms the important debates. I don't know if you agree with that, Sam, but they go further by saying US policy towards Africa on infrastructure development would help African societies by improving the allocation of capital towards much needed infrastructure. The one-sided China-Africa deals is because there aren't a lot of potential funders. How do you respond to that, Tam? Your microphone is muted. Your microphone is muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I think that's a great point, and I'll just take it step by step. I think that Yes, in general, you're right. The media has been skewed largely towards the West and the United States on the debt trap diplomacy that China is engaging with. I mean, some recent studies actually show that they do not engage in predatory lending. The reason why they have very strict and for lack of a better term, collateral requirements is because many African countries have poor credit ratings. And I think that's important. And I think I mentioned that also. So yes, that is generally correct. But we've been seeing it as Dr. Kuma mentioned, when you have that amount of direct investments, in infrastructure in a country, at some point you must start thinking about protecting that investment. Because you can see in those days, 20, 30, 40 years ago, when the US was still a major net importer of oil, you could see certain of their activity in the Middle East, even though they preach about rule of law, some things that they engage with, and not necessarily in tandem with, conversation about rule of law, because they had pipelines that needed to be protected, gas, oil pipelines. China's deployment of a new base in Djibouti, I believe, the Horn of Africa, I think, is an important step that we're seeing China taking. But also to balance that, the United States has over 800 military installations outside the United States. So that is an important point. So by far and large, China is nowhere close to the military power of the United States, not even remotely close. So I think it's also important to balance that. So that person's comment was actually, I think, correct and important, because the media is tending to be skewed away, and also because maybe it has something to do culturally. It's just the amount of secrecy in a lot of these agreements and transactions. It's hard to find data, and when you can find data, you generally can assume that somebody is being shifty or being, doing something wrong. But I think that's why I said that, we do need the investments in infrastructure, but we also need this to be transparent. We need people to know the terms of these agreements, especially when you're going to use public debt to fund this. And another important thing I want to mention is that a lot of Africans' debt is not from China. It's actually from private bondholders in general. Create these bonds and they floated on the European market. I mean, China is, as an individual country, is a major participant in providing debt to, in fact, the largest creditor to Africa. But on a larger scale, I think Africa has over $600 billion in debt, and about 200 and something, a lot of that comes from private bondholders who are holding African bond. So I just wanted to put that in perspective, because sometimes there's not an opportunity to be more nuanced in these conversations. But to be clear, yes, you're right. But with more, as we push for more transparency, I think it's from there we can start to understand with respect to a lot of these transactions that go on between China and our continent.
Yeah, I support that. I mean, as you said, with great transparency, then we can start to understand who holds who what. Because as you said, that we often make that general assumption that all Africa's debt, if not an overwhelming of it, is owed to China. But as you said, these debts are very multi-layered. So we are on the home stretch end. And for the questions that we have, I would like each of you to respond with 1 minute, and I'll be sure to time us for that 1 minute. So I'm going to start with you, Prof. Professor Kumabiu. There's this question from Kingsley Tanke, and they asked, with the growing competitiveness of China and the US for Africa, in your point of view, do you think we'll get to a stage where we'll have to choose one of them to do business with and ditch the other? 1 minute, Prof.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't foresee that. My belief is that we're going to engage with the two. The China and the US will continue within the next couple of years, major players in the global system. I'm also believing that Africa as a continent and the various countries making up the continent should also be a major player. So with our, as I said earlier on, I know my time is short, but with the way we have embraced liberal democratic ethos and values, I think we're going to stick to that, which is going to push us more to the West. And then China, of course, will still get the economic support. But until China, I don't foresee how they will democratize going the liberal way. But I don't think many countries in Africa will embrace authoritarian, values or, political systems. So we're going to stick to the West, largely.
Right.
But in essence, we're going to engage with the two countries.
Yeah, you know what's funny, Prof? It's interesting that almost all of us, Tam, I think you're in Arizona, Prof, I think you're in Tennessee. I'm currently in Washington. So it seems like all of us are advocating for pro-West because of the political angle of it. Because, I mean, I do support you. Even if you have the best economy, if your government is authoritarian, it's absolute nonsense. So again, it's much more tolerable to have a freer democracy. Maybe not, you do want to call it democracy, a freer society and a prosperous economy to go with it. So thanks for that, Prof.
Now I'm in Ohio anyway.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Ohio.
That's all right. Thank you.
All right. I don't know if Folarin is there, so we can ask you this next question. Yeah. Okay, Folarin, 1 minute. Adekunle Adeyeye asked, how can Africa define our trade relation with China when we look at the many jobs Chinese nationals occupy, despite local content policy that most African countries have? In other words, I think they're trying to ask, we have Chinese expatriates or expats coming into Africa, taking up jobs. How do you respond to that in 1 minute?
Yes, thank you very much. I think first and foremost, it still boils down to the political will of our leaders in Africa here. They need to put their feet on the ground and insist that in whatever trade policy that is being drafted or signed, strict adherence to local content, and it must be enforced to the letter, which is very, very important. We can't deprive our young population of opportunities of massive income to the detriment of the so-called leading trade partner. No, I think we should strike a balance between the two, but which is very, very important. Of course, yes, we need to be competitive. We need to up our game, but we mustn't negate the fact that the policy should favor our young population, which is very, very important. It is non-negotiable. So it is brought down to political leadership as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Folarin. That's sort of short and sweet. This comment from David. They asked, the effect of Russian sanctions by the US and EU makes countries nervous about the sovereignty of their payment systems. The more likely result would be a monetary system where countries rely on the US dollars trading national currency settlement for trade. For regional trade, it's a more sustainable system, but the dollar isn't going to disappear overnight. Okay, that's a currency issue. And more so on currency issue, if you can get 1 minute from you, Tam, then 1 minute from Prof. So Tam, this person, anonymous attendee, asked, in view of Brazil and China's new trade deal that boycotts the dollar, what are the implications for Africa, if any? And if more countries decide to boycott the dollar and other top currencies, could that help in attaining a multipolar world? I think the prof can answer that question later, but Tam, do you have any opinion about this currency approach or this currency conundrum?
I mean, I want more competition in currency with respect to the currency people countries choose to have their reserves in. I would recommend people have their reserves in Bitcoin and gold, but if you want to have your reserves in dollars, that's fine. But you just have to understand with respect to the value of the currency, that's the purchasing power of the currency with respect to what you can buy with it. Right now, people still use the dollar. The Fed has raised rates to keep the dollar from slipping more and more. So I don't, this is much of a political economy conversation. I think is much more deeper than we have space in one time to navigate. But my recommendation is you want to secure your currency for the next global recession and depression, buy Bitcoin and gold. And that is not financial advice, by the way. Over to you, Doctor.
You know the funny thing, before I come to Prof,
I think time is going to recruit me into the Bitcoin, arena.
I was about to say, because, we both are from Nigeria, and as you are aware, Prof, there was this recent nonsense by Central Bank of Nigeria that's pretty much blocked the currency for a long while because they want to rebrand the currency. And people say, well, that's why you need to embrace Bitcoin. So I guess this is another reason for people, as you said, time to embrace Bitcoin. But Prof, I'll give you the chance to give us a closing.
Now, so here's my opinion on this. The dollar is powerful. The dollar has become the global currency because of the economic and political stability of the United States. The other countries can, believe that there's not going to be a political implosion or explosion within the United States. The economy is stable, you can predict. Now, what is going on with the alternative, whether the China and Russia, I think it's more of a political talk or political reaction to, trying to counter the West. But I don't see it in a foreseeable future that's going to change, because of the standing of the United States economically and then politically in the world. The other aspect of the question, as we know, Putin is in South Africa now. There's an arrest warrant on him, but I don't think the South African government is going to give him out. So I'm not happy with his policy in Ukraine, his encroaching and all that. But at the same time, my goal for Africa is that Africa should not be bullied by the international system. We should be able to make independent, foreign policy decisions ourselves, and then the world should respect that. So again, my goal for Africa is that Africa needs to be understood as a major player in the international system. That Africa should not be considered as a periphery power. Africa, and then we ourselves, we need to rethink, that way, that we need to be very, very active in the international system and not just considered as, periphery, but we need to have the ability, within. So that's my view. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Prof. And we are really out of time. I want to thank you, Prof. Felix Kumar Biwu, for your time, and also Tam Alex, our fellow at African Liberty, and of course, Folarin. We hope you run again and get to the National Assembly this time around, or the next time around. But also, thank you.